I'm Michael Ignatieff, Rector and President of Central European University. I'm delighted to see faculty, staff, and students here. I'm also delighted to welcome distinguished guests from the city of Vienna and from public life. And I'm delighted to have you all here this afternoon. We have a very special treat this afternoon. The Aspen Ministers Forum is meeting in Vienna. The Aspen Ministers Forum is a collection of distinguished public servants from around the world who've made a long-term commitment to continue serving the public after having served their countries in very senior and distinguished posts. One of the wonderful things that happened to us is that the Aspen Ministers Forum said to CEU, we'd like to come to see you. And so that's why we're in the room this afternoon, because some very distinguished international statesmen wanted to send a message of support and respect for the work that we do as a university. I just want to say, as the rector of CEU, and I think on behalf of everybody, how grateful we are to the Aspen Ministers Forum, to the leaders here, for choosing us as your venue for a public discussion. It's a very important moment for us. I'm going to introduce the panel very briefly. We're going to have a discussion on the theme of avoiding new walls, lessons from 1989. I am in the happy circumstance of not having to introduce these people at all because they'll be known to every single one of you. Daniel Mitov was the distinguished foreign minister of Bulgaria between 2014 and 2017. Madeleine Albright was the first female to occupy the post of Secretary of State of the United States. She was also, needless to say, the very distinguished ambassador of the United States to the United Nations. And Joschka Fischer was the foreign minister of Germany and vice chancellor between 1998 and 2005. And we're going to have a no-holds-barred discussion among them about the lessons that they've learned about 1989, how we avoid building new walls in Europe, and I have invited them to look forward to the future. This is an audience of students, and we want to look backward in reflection on what happened in 1989, but boy, do we need to look forward to how we deal with the challenges in the future. But before we begin, I wanted to introduce a very distinguished guest, one of the CEU's oldest friends, constant supporter of the work we do, Alex Soros, who's a trustee of this university, vice president of the Open Society Foundation. And I invite him to say a few words before we kick off the event. Alex?
Good afternoon, everybody. It's really an honor to be here with you at CEU in Vienna. Rector Ignatieff, thank you for your steadfast leadership. You have kept this university together and kept it among the world's greatest, despite the immense challenges that you and all of us have had to go through. I could not think of a better place to convene a discussion on the lessons of 1989 than here at the CEU, to talk about the walls that came down 30 years ago and the new ones that are going up. I'm an American and a Hungarian and someone who spent much of his life in the United Kingdom. Sadly, this is a time when the President of the United States is determined to erect a needless and unpopular wall on our southern border, when Hungary has stretched a barbed wire barrier along its Serbian border to keep out refugees, whether they're real or imaginary. I think sometimes the imaginary ones seem to be more threatening. And when the United Kingdom itself may dissolve, creating walls in the form of new borders. But there's an obvious other metaphorical wall, even closer to home, and that was the wall erected by Viktor Orban to keep out academic freedom from Hungary itself. CEU is the first university in the history of the European Union to be shut down and banned, forced across what was once the Iron Curtain here to Austria, just as many Hungarians fled the Soviet bloc before 1989, including my own grandparents. 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, it goes without saying that these are trying times for the concept of open society. But being George Soros' son imbues you with certain perspectives and experiences. I was 4 years old when the wall fell, so my attachment to the symbolism is not as strong. But as a family, we spent most of our free time away from school, all of our family vacations, accompanying my father and mother, opening, visiting foundations, and trying to address the issues of what I like to call the Prague to Tashkent axis of the former Soviet Empire and former Yugoslavia. There was always hope and gratitude wherever we went, but also frustration and disappointments were just as frequent. I think that is something that we forget. Market fundamentalism meant that capitalism became a threat to open society. I remember as a young 5-year-old the constant failures to get a Marshall Plan for Russia. There was a struggle for Roma rights, which continues today, because there is a realization that they were dependent as the bloc's biggest minority without a state and vulnerable to discrimination because of that, dependent on state industry that had left. And probably most vividly, I recall my father visiting Bosnia after the war broke out and rushing home to alert any American official that would listen that the march towards open society was over and that it had been replaced by the return of genocide and nationalism on the European continent. I accept that coming from a Jewish family and being the son of a Holocaust survivor, I'm particularly sensitive to nationalism. But in the wake of recent anti-Semitic attacks, I think it's important to say that this didn't start with Viktor Orban. It started from the beginning. The idea that somehow nation states with histories of heinous ethnic violence could be part of a new Europe was a great challenge, a huge endeavor. It needed resources, and the creation of Central European University was part of this endeavor, as well as the network of foundations which my father created in the region. I don't bring this up to reaffirm a commitment to a utopian ideal. Rather, it is to say that open society can still win, that we can avoid new walls so long as we are open to new opportunities and avenues of engagement and to fight the new threats to open society with the new tactics available for us. And we have in particular two special guests here who have spent their lives tearing down walls. And we are eager to hear from them. As Rector Ignatieff noted, each year, Madeleine Albright and the Aspen Ministers Forum can choose any city in the world as their venue. This year, they chose Vienna specifically to be here in solidarity with CEU and to take up these difficult questions. I would like to thank them personally and on behalf of my father, who couldn't be here, for being here and for doing that. Secretary Albright was no ordinary Secretary of State. She's an accomplished academic and a scholar and a true critical thinker. She's always willing to revisit her own views and assumptions in light of changing circumstances like the ones that face us today. If there's one thing I've encountered a lot in my life, it's statesmen and professors, and I can attest that that is truly a rare quality. No offense to any of the professors in the audience. It is also an honor to have Joschka Fischer here. Growing up, he was an icon to me. I believe his speech in the year 2000 at Humboldt University and actions thereafter still remain as ambitious and realistic a framework for the future of the European project today. I also believe that had his warnings during the financial crisis post-2008 been heeded by the German government not to impose German Europe and maintain a European Germany, that a lot of the threats that we see today in the European political landscape would look very different today, and the CEU would possibly still be fully functional in Budapest. They will be joined by Daniel Mitov, who is Foreign Affairs Minister for Bulgaria and played a pivotal role in shaping Bulgarian foreign policy since the historical Wales Summit in 2014. I just met Daniel for the first time in the green room. He seems very nice. I can't wax as poetic on him as Madeleine and Joschka, but I'll be listening most eagerly to your comments. So, ladies and gentlemen, just let's give a big thank you for them for being here, for traveling here, and for this amazing panel. And thank you all for having me as well.
Thank you very much, Alex. That's framed the discussion, and I'd just like to say before we resume normal operations and the discussion, to express, first of all, that this is a free institution, and people can stand up and make their views known. The fact that they have walked out without listening seems to me to be a violation of the deepest commitments of this university. The fact that they have stood up and interrupted somebody before she had a chance to speak seems also, in my view, the deepest violation of what this university stands for. And so let us proceed. I leave to Secretary Albright, who's an experienced public statesman, to decide whether she replies or not. In my view, she's under no obligation to reply whatever. I would like, if possible, to begin, I leave it up to the secretary, but I would invite her to speak to the subject for which she has kindly agreed to appear, and that is, having been an active public figure for 30 plus years, whether she can reflect on what she thinks we got right and what we didn't get right about 1989. The we here, obviously, is the policy of the United States, her as a great statesman, whether she has feelings about that question, and I give the floor to her with immense gratitude for her presence in the room today.
Thank you very much, Rick. I'm delighted to be here and have an opportunity to have a discussion with everybody, because that's what freedom is about, and so I'm delighted to be here. Let me just say, I was born up the road. I was born in Prague and spent the war, World War II, in London. My father was the Czechoslovak ambassador to Yugoslavia, and then when the communists took over, we moved to the United States. And I was very interested, Alex, in what you had said about the Marshall Plan, because all Central and Eastern Europe were invited to go be a part of the Marshall Plan. Czechoslovakia accepted, and then was called to Moscow and told no way. And my father was the chief of staff to Jan Masaryk, who was the foreign minister, when he came back from Moscow, and he said, "I now recognize that I'm not the foreign minister, because we are not a sovereign country." And I think that was really the beginning of seeing what it meant to be behind the Iron Curtain. And so I grew up kind of thinking about what all the things were that had happened in this part of the world By the way, I was the perfect daughter, and so I always did whatever my father was studying. And so I wrote my thesis at Wellesley on a man called Zdeněk Fierlinger, who was known as a fellow traveler. And while the communists actually won the election in 1946 in Czechoslovakia, he helped to make sure that the coalition government ultimately welcomed the communists. I wrote my dissertation on the Czechoslovak press in 1968, the Prague Spring. I wrote a book about the Solidarity Press, and so I have spent my whole life studying Central and Eastern Europe and trying to sort out how what happened really happened. And so it was with great joy that I saw 1989. What was interesting, by the way, as a Czechoslovak American, as the Hungarian 1956 happened, and then the Poles had revolutions every 10 years, and people would say, "What's the matter with your people? The Czechs never do anything." And so there was a sense of great pride, I had to say, when the students, and we've just celebrated that, November 17th, the anniversary of the Velvet Revolution, and Václav Havel coming into office. And so there really was a sense that a corner had been turned and that this part of the world was going to be able to operate with the kind of governments that they wanted. And I have to say that in my various roles, I have welcomed the growth of freedom in this part of the world, and then had looked at it, I think, with some sadness recently in terms of the things that we've been seeing, and especially what happened in Hungary, I think, very much. And so I've spent a lot of time here beyond, I won't go through all the details, but have studied a lot, and I have been trying to figure out what went wrong, because there was an incredible sense of euphoria about everything. There was a sense that everybody was on the right road. I think there was a desire in certainly in the United States and in Western Europe to try to be helpful to the changes that were happening. And so trying to figure out why there has been such a rise of hyper-nationalism, of a sense of not knowing what directions people need to go in. And I really think that Hungary is the best example of the worst. I met Viktor Orban in 1986. He was everybody's favorite dissident, and trying to figure out what really did go wrong with him. I think, in trying to be fair about things, is that we expected, those that studied the situation, that once you had the opportunity of democracy, that it would just be kind of picked up and it would really work and it wouldn't be that hard. Also, to be a complete Czechoslovak chauvinist, Czechoslovakia was the only democracy in the interwar period, and that there really would be a sense that they knew what they were going to be doing. And so that didn't happen. So I think that part of the issue is that we didn't fully understand the penetration of authoritarianism and communism of 50 years and the effect that it had on people's lives. I also think that to some extent privatization happened too quickly. There was a way that those who could grasp what they could without thinking about what it did to the general society. And I think that also that we in the West spent too much time dealing with the elites, the most interesting people, and all kinds of people that were parts of conferences and didn't think about what, and I never know what the right adjective is, how ordinary people lived. And that while communism may have been terrible, they in fact did have jobs. They had some real entrance into an educational system and a health system, and that we truly didn't understand how hard it was, and that this was going to be magical. And so those are the things I think we now have to figure out what is going on. I do think also, and I have talked about this in other settings, is that there are two mega trends that are taking place, and their downside. One mega trend is globalization, and we've all benefited from globalization, but it is also faceless. And so people want to know what their identity is, their religious or linguistic, ethnic in many ways, and that's fine. I think we're all entitled to do that. It's just that when my identity hates your identity, it becomes nationalism, and hyper-nationalism is very dangerous. So that is one mega trend. The other one is technology, which has really helped people incredibly. I often talk about the Kenyan woman farmer who no longer has to spend a lot of time walking to pay her bills. She can do it now with a mobile phone, and she's able to start a business or have an education. The downside of it is separated voices, disaggregated voices. And so people get their information through echo chambers. They don't quite know how to really push in order to organize themselves. And so I think that has been the downside. And we are now dealing in a world that has technology that is not always dedicated to helping. We have democracies that are not delivering. And I think we're living in a very complex time. I have always gone back to look over what I've done wrong. And I do think that, in fact, we were too, I think in some ways, blinded to the fact that the wall had come down and that all these revolutions had happened and that the people we met were dedicated Democrats with a small d, and all of a sudden something else happened.
Thank you, Secretary Albright, for getting us right to the issues. You raised some key ones about the impact of digitization, the digital economy, the new technologies. I think that's an under-discussed element of the ambiguous legacy of 1989. But I wanted to go right away to Joschka Fischer, and if I can just give him a helpful prompt. One of the ways in which one of the distinctive features of your country is that the line between East and West passed right through the heartland of a great nation. And 30 years on, one thing you might say is that the eastern part of your country remains East Germany in a way that's entirely unexpected. It's not what was supposed to happen. You may not want to take that theme up, but it is one theme I'd like to discuss because it's not often we have someone of your expertise in the room, and I'd love to hear you on that subject, but I don't want to, I want to give you free rein to start with an opening comment.
Well, few weeks after the wall came down by sheer chance, I was in D.C. And there I met, I've forgotten the name, I met an American. We talked about unification, how fast it will go and what will happen. And he looked very skeptical at me and said, well, after the Civil War, we needed 100 years to reach the moment of the civil rights movement. I will never forget that. It needed a long time. But on the other side, let's face it, 1989 and the decade since then is a great success story. If you look to Eastern Europe, even if you look to the Western Balkans, it's a huge success story. And I think Europe is a bad salesman. The transfers the European Union made to improve the economic conditions, to improve the society, the infrastructure, whatever, in Eastern and Southeastern Europe is tremendous. All the resources coming from Brussels, starting with the Common Agriculture Policy, the regional funds, the cohesion funds. And it's not only money for members, but also for candidate countries. We are bad in selling that and making a powerful mission statement out of that. I think the solidarity between East and West is really a success story. When I look back what went wrong, I would say compared to the generation of 1945, the generation of 1989 didn't have the courage and the perspective to understand that this is the moment to create a new world order. Because with the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the collapse of the Iron Curtain, it was quite clear that the world order, which was a result of de facto 2 world wars, definitely of the Second World War, wouldn't exist any longer. I think, in an ironic way, the most serious blow the Soviet Union made against was its disappearance. I asked myself, why was nationalism coming back? Why? I mean, maybe my country is a little bit educated about German history, you could see the country was almost completely destroyed by the most extreme form of nationalism, by the Nazis. It was morally almost completely destroyed by being responsible for the Holocaust and terrible war crimes in East and West. So how can people think against these obvious facts that nationalism can be again an option? But with my 71 years, I made some experiences. And one experience is, we have a saying in Germany, if the donkey feels too well, he's going dancing on the ice. So we know how this will end. We experienced many times. Donkeys are not created by the evolution for ice dancing. And the result are broken legs. It's obvious. But I think human beings, they have a kind of 70-year cycles in themselves, in all of us, where we start to forget the experience, where the experience is not any longer so important. And now, after 30 years, we see that enlargement of EU and NATO, it was very important, but it was not enough. It didn't create a new identity, as Madeleine said. It didn't create a new understanding of the West in the world, which will not be any longer dominated by the West. 1989 was the great game changer. And I think what we failed is to react in a proper way, not only by enlargement existing structures. Again, this was very important. Do not misinterpret my words. But it was not enough, obviously. So we are now we are moving into a world which will not be Western-centered any longer. Even America is now challenged by China. So the rise of China is by itself a kind of global revolution of the international system. And then America, I never have dreamed about it, that one day an American president will question NATO. The left wing of my party did that traditionally. Okay, if a green from the left wing is questioning NATO, nobody takes it very serious because it belongs to the basic instincts. But an American president, if you would have asked me in 1989 whether there will be an American president who will questioning NATO, I would have said, what have you drunk? Because I would never have thought that this is realistic, but it's now a matter of fact. And allow me to say that Trump is a revolution, a real revolution. Whether he understands that or not doesn't matter. He is the most powerful man on earth as American president. And what America does or does not is extremely relevant. So here we are. And the third is a new digital world is emerging. These are consequences of 1989. I didn't mention Brexit. I asked myself, Fischer, do you believe that the Brits would have voted for the Brexit if the Soviet Union still would exist? My answer is no. So, with the disappearance of the enemy of outside, people, or some people, started to look for the enemy from inside. So they digged in the old graveyards of nationalism and brought back this nationalist ideology. I think we underestimated that. And by the way, the war machine, we have met us in the war machine. My 51st birthday, it was right at the top of the Kosovo War, April the 12th, 1989. I was sitting in the NAC, in the North Atlantic Council, in the midst of a war. I confess I had some serious problems not to burst out in laughter because it was a highly ironic situation for me. But without, why did NATO went to war in Kosovo? We didn't act much too long in Bosnia. Innocent people were murdered, slaughtered. Innocent women were mass raped. And this was only one war. And this breaking up of Yugoslavia ended in great human catastrophes. So the Europeans were not able to act by themselves. Then President Chirac wanted to do it. But we didn't have the capabilities. Without the US, it was impossible. And in the US, it was highly, highly disputed. So it was Madeleine Albright who was a driving force. And you should be proud about that. Because I think you ended an endless bloodshed. We went not to war for national glory or for new territories or whatever. We went to war against the greater Serbian nationalism because this had to be stopped. That's a matter of fact. So, and there we met, and since then we are close friends. So, the end of the Cold War created also new friendships, as I've seen, Madeleine. And so we shouldn't be too negative. We shouldn't be too pessimistic about that. At the end, I think what we need is time. Look to your neighbor, Hungary. They are still struggling with Trianon, 100 years ago. They are still struggling with that. Or our Polish friends, they are still traumatized by their geopolitical situation. Germany at the west, Russia at the east. They are still struggling. And, but on the other side, I see also the progress. For me, the last European election was a big defeat for Viktor Orban. So relax, cool down. We have to stick to our principles, and time will play a very important role. So I'm pretty optimistic.
Thank you. There are many things we will all remember from both of these opening remarks. One of them we'll remember is the image of donkeys skating on the ice. Now, what distinguishes our third participant, of course, is that he was, I think, a young boy in 1989, and so his perspective is of necessity different and equally interesting. That is, you've lived your conscious political life in a new world. And when you look at the same facts that two distinguished statesmen have looked at, that is, what's happened in the last 30 years, that the 30 years in which you have come to maturity and become a a leader of your country, what do you think we got right, got wrong? What lessons do you take from your generation of this experience?
Well, first, let me thank you all for the invitation and for the possibility and to be in such a distinguished company. Indeed, I was 11 when the wall fell. But since I come from a highly, let's say, politicized family, this period was filled with expectations, with anticipation, with a lot of hope. First in the family, but then on the streets of Sofia. The biggest rallies, political rallies I have seen, the biggest joy, mass joy I have seen in Bulgaria was in those times. And even if I was a child, essentially, that is imprinted in my memory like it has happened yesterday. But I have to tell you something else. My 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, took me and my family, I mean, we were at that time in Soviet Russia. We were not in Bulgaria because my father, my family in general, was considered ideologically unreliable for the regime. That was the exact term which they used, the communists, ideologically unreliable, because my grandfather was in the monarch's army. So those people and their descendants were considered, better watch out. So my father was sent. Also, those of you who have studied the communist regimes, and especially Bulgaria, you know that you couldn't find a job. In the communist regime, you don't find a job. The jobs finds you. The local party committee is basically giving you a job. They appoint you to a certain spot. And my father was initially he's not among us anymore, unfortunately, but he was a teacher. He was a biology teacher, and then all of a sudden they decided that because of his unreliability, he needs to be sent to one of the coldest regions in Russia, Komi, which is between Karelia and Siberia and the Ural Mountain in the middle, as a lumberjack. There was a wood industry that was, and I lived there for quite a while, and I can say that when we learned in the family that the Berlin Wall fell and the communism is over in Bulgaria, the first thing my father did was to load me and my brother on a plane and send us back to Bulgaria. Because we don't know, we didn't know at the time whether the Soviet Union will hold on or not. And they came back, and I remember the happiness and the rallies on the street and the hope. Joschka said correctly that the Soviet Union fell apart and basically was absolutely right to say that the UK wouldn't vote to secede from the European Union if the Soviet Union was still alive. But I would say that the Soviet Union still lives in the heads of a lot of people, not only in my country, but in Eastern Europe in general. So it's a matter of generation. What we learned, both on national level and on, let's say, on a little bit more of a global scale, I'll try to synthesize very quickly. So first, when it comes to the former communist countries, the first thing we learned is that we had to dismantle way better, and some of us didn't. We had to dismantle way better, way more efficiently the former state security apparatus. Because communism was over, democracy was coming in, but those former state security networks remained alive to a great extent. We didn't lustrate anyone. they found their way little by little to the business of the country, to the top business positions of the country. They found their way to capital, to the privatization process, and to the top political positions. And they continued their relationships with other former state security people from the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe in general. That was one mistake, that we didn't really dismantle those networks and lustrate those people as well as we could. Second, we learned the reforms, the democratic reforms were very much centered on the creation of a free market, which was an absolute requirement, and that was a good thing. But we underestimated the importance of the judicial reform. The European Union also learned a lesson here, that you start with the judiciary, or at least you do the judiciary in parallel with the free market, otherwise it's not going to work. And when it comes to some of the countries in Eastern Europe, the prosecutorial segment remained a Soviet-style prosecution, vertical, top-down, under one control, uncontrolled, completely and utterly unleashed. Which of course, to a great extent, created with the years, for 30 years, created possibilities for misuse of prosecutorial powers. And then comes the media environment. We never really managed to create a free media environment. In the 90s, there was a little bit of everything. There was a little bit of freedom, but then huge oligarchical and financial interests started consolidating and basically acquiring larger and larger pieces of the media environment until basically it was not almost monopolized. And here I'm speaking about Bulgaria in general. In other Eastern European countries is way better than that. But this is one of the lessons definitely valid for Bulgaria. On a little bit more of a global scale, I mentioned already that the reforms and the hope for the spread of democracy, for the end of history, the inevitability of the spread of democracy was related to a great extent with the idea that if we globalize the free market, if we include everyone, the free global market will serve as a vehicle for liberal democratic values. And little by little, people will start pressuring their autocrats around the world for more freedoms and more concessions in terms of reform, in terms of democratic reform. Somewhere that happened, but in some major cases, actually, we achieved the opposite. We gave the possibility for the autocrats to benefit from open markets on global scale, to accumulate resources with which to tighten or to basically tighten the control over their own populations. And even we have arrived already to the moment in which autocrats can try and meddle in the democratic process, in the liberal democratic countries. When we speak about the crisis of democracy, yes, we do have our problems, but this moment is not entirely created because of our own internal mistakes. It is also influenced by hostile interests which come from the outside, especially in the area of disinformation and so on. Second point, we did not, I think, assess to the maximum extent the idea that when we globalize and when we interact on the international scene, countries do not exchange only people, capital, and goods. We exchange also the ways how our institutions function. And we hoped that our institutions, being way more humane and better and so on, they will prevail in this type of fight of influence. Turns out that democracies also have weak points. We see them now, which is beneficial. We have the chance to reform them. But what is worrisome, especially in that regard for me, is that autocrats managed very well to weaponize corruption and find the way of that particular plague into the democratic systems. I very often illustrate this by describing when German business comes to Bulgaria, what they do first is basically they hire a law firm in order to know how to move within the legal environment. When Russian business comes to Bulgaria, they come with suitcases, and they always find someone who will take the suitcase, because that's how it functions with them. That's what they export, together with gas and oil. This is the other point. And just to confirm and reiterate what Secretary Albright was saying about technology, we live in a Gutenberg moment. We live in a very changing. We live in a crucial point in human history, which is comparable to the moment in 15th century when Gutenberg invented the printing press. No one has monopoly over information anymore. Everyone has a megaphone. Everyone can say whatever they want, and the people are connected globally. So this is a very, very different situation than what it was in the 90s, and we underestimated this heavily.
Thank you. We're going to do two things now. The first is I'm going to ask the three distinguished people on the platform to interact a bit. They may have heard something they think is just crazy or wrong, or they want to amplify something, and I hope we can do that very quickly. And then what I want to do, and this would bring us to a conclusion, is get out into the audience for questions. We have been told, the students will be delighted to know, that this group of distinguished people wants to hear from students first. So I have to discriminate against my own colleagues and friends in the faculty and take a first question from students. So we'll get there in just a minute. I'm glad I saw a hand go up. A question, as you know, is a short interrogative statement followed by a question mark, sharply distinguished from a statement, and it's one per customer, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But I just wanted to make sure whether Minister Fischer, Secretary Albright, Minister Mitov had another comment to make about something they've heard from their colleagues.
Well, I do think the point that you made, Danny, about the judiciary, and I think part of it certainly makes sense, but it is very hard to do. And partially because there were not, in any of the places, kind of trained legal experts that were willing to and were capable of taking the spots right away, despite the fact that it seems to make the most sense. And I do think that it's to a general point that while it may have looked that people were prepared for the wall to come down and for changes, in terms of the things that were really needed, I think that they hadn't kind of focused on it. They had on the press, and I speak to that from my writings on how they thought the press should work, but the bottom line is I think the combination of the legal system and the other thing that you said earlier about the police or the security system made it very complicated. For me, in watching the people that I got to know, I don't know how anybody knew whom to trust, because it turns out that a lot of the people that they were friends with turned out to be stool pigeons, or they had, in order to get along, done all kinds of things. And so it would have been very hard. I think you're absolutely right, but I can see why it might have been hard.
Joschka?
I think it's hard to figure out how you can manage such a historical change in a very limited time. Usually, in the old days, such a historical change was a result of terrible wars. And the end of the Soviet Union was happening almost without the use of force and violence, almost. So it's a good experience. But on the other side, when I compare what happened in 1989 to what happened in the immediate interwar period in occupied Germany, there it was quite clear that the Allied occupation governments had to run the country. So there was a huge difference. But all in all, I think it was happening in the right way, and there NATO and especially EU played an important role to guide the new member states. And even today, we have a discussion about the role of the judiciary in a very different way in Poland. There, the judiciary is under attack by neo-nationalist political forces. And the EU is playing an important role to limit the negative consequences. Same in Hungary. So we should be also grateful about the power of the existing transnational institutions. It played a very important role. And not to forget the integration in the security field. I mean, in Europe, it was always the threat that the old order of intra-European conflict can come back. I don't have to explain to you the realities in the Western Balkans. But suddenly you thought we are back in the period immediately before First World War I, when Yugoslavia started to collapse and to disintegrate. It was not only Yugoslavia. And the real alarming fact about Macedonia was that we are going back to the Balkan Wars, 1912-13, with the drawing in the Albanians, the Serbs, the Bulgarians, and Greece. It was a real option. So from that point of view, I think it went all in all pretty well. We cannot change the fundamentals. I mean, Germany, we have this debate. It had to be a high-speed transformation. Why? Because you never knew whether the next morning the president of the Soviet Union will be still Mikhail Gorbachev, or whether he will be gone and the door would be closed again. Then we would sit here and talk about a missed opportunity. So this enormous time pressure created a certain also bad feelings. We experienced that in East Germany. And let's face it, West Germany was westernized over decades, and it was a painful, by then painful and very confrontational process. It was not, we are all Democrats and so on. So it was a huge fight from the founding of the Federal Republic in 1949 up to the 80s. Then the wall came down. But East Germans never experienced this westernization. I will give you an example. One day I came back home. I was tired but couldn't sleep, so I switched on the TV. And in one of these typical European channels, I think it was Dreisat, there was a piece about the former field marshal who were commanding the German troops in Stalingrad. The Russians drew him on their side after he was prisoner of war, and he was seen as a traitor. So when the Russians released him, he was going to Dresden, to the GDR. And they interviewed high-ranking GDR generals, which were young staff officers in his staff. And how they spoke about the field marshal, well, it was the same casino tone as you could find in the old Wehrmacht. There was no difference. And with the uniforms, there was no difference in East Germany. It was full continuation. And I think this difference between East and West is extremely important, that we went through a kind of organic transformation, and the East was forced under the time pressure into an immediate jump into a new world. One last sentence. I think the economic history of this transformation is not written. I mean, not the macroeconomics. I mean, these nitty-gritty transformation of intelligence networks, bringing aside billions of whatever. This is not written. I think this is an opportunity for young students to do that.
There you are.
Because it will be an extremely interesting story.
It's a good direction to look into, and we know already a lot, but we need to put it on paper. You're absolutely right.
So there you are. You've just got a dozen master's and PhD theses for free. The economic history of the transformation in 1989, the secret history, the corruption history, the inward investment flow history, the restructuring of the economy history, the social distribution consequences of economic growth. Boy, you got a lifetime of work ahead of you, folks. Let's now do the second part, concluding part of this. The event is going to conclude sharply at 3:30, so we have about 25 minutes. And as I said earlier, we got a question from students. I saw a hand go up right there, and I will try to get around a question here. And wait for the microphone if you can, so that we can all hear the question. Great, thank you very much. And okay, fire away.
All right, great. Well, Mrs. Albright, Mr. Fischer, Mr. Mitov, thanks a lot for participating. So I have a question about NATO. I was hoping each of you could talk a little bit about how NATO's rationale, its mission, changed over time. So maybe Mr. Fischer, if you could talk about how NATO, why it didn't cease to exist after '89, how it developed. Maybe Mrs. Albright, if you could continue talking about how NATO evolved in the late 90s and onwards with expansion. And then Mr. Mitov, if you could talk a bit about some more current trends, especially in light of Mr. Mitov's comment, which was interesting, that the Soviet Union is still alive in the minds of Eastern Europeans. If you could each maybe provide a little bit of critical input in that context. Is it alive in the minds of other Europeans, Americans as well?
Okay. Any attempt to direct these guys is bound to fail, but okay. I admire your courage for trying. Let's do the NATO question right away. I think what we may then do is accumulate a bunch of questions so we get as many as possible. Why don't we talk very briefly about NATO?
Well, let me just say the following thing, having been there when NATO expanded, and partially trying to see what happened when the Soviet Union fell apart. I think that NATO is clearly the most powerful military and political alliance in the history of the world, and the question is what its mandate was with the fall of the Soviet Union, and I believe that it continues to be an alliance of those that understand that there needs to be collective action when terrible things happen somewhere else. And what really did happen for a long time was that NATO was active out of area. And the Balkans was out of area, Afghanistan was out of area, and that while people talk about 2% of a budget, it should be 100% for democracy, because it also was a political alliance that people kind of forgot about. And since I was there when it expanded, one of the things that we did talk about, and I spoke with Yeltsin myself, about the fact that it was no longer against the Soviet Union, but it was this alliance, and they at some stage were welcome to take part in it if they met the criteria. So I think it continues to play an important role. It is trying to figure out what its role is now vis-a-vis in area because of what the Russians have done, and also because of cyber threats and a whole host of other issues which are kind of known as gray zone, what happens in space, and they are looking for new mandates. But part of what happened is countries wanted to be a part of NATO, and while there is criticism for the expansion, I asked people to think about what would have happened if the countries between Germany and Russia were not a member of some kind of an organization that supported democratic cooperation.
I think the biggest advantage of NATO, beyond keeping the Russians out, that all the intentions to move further to the West were blocked, was that NATO really changed the traditional European power politics. Europe usually had three major challenges in power politics. It was the open flank to the east and the trouble with the center, because since German unification in 1871, there was a problem of a strong Germany with a very strong industrial apparatus and with hegemonial ambition. So this was all changed by NATO. Lord Ismay, British top general and first NATO General Secretary, said it: keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Now, this is more or less correct. You wouldn't say today the Germans down, but to avoid a return of a German threat. Russia, the Soviet Union is gone, but Russia still exists. And there is a deep, deep rift between Russia and Europe. In Russia, the law must follow the power. In Europe, the power has to follow the law. That's the difference. And as long as Russia is following the traditional course, I think we will have a Russian security problem. Whether we like it or not, I would like it to have it not, but it's a matter of fact. But to avoid this stepping back into traditional power politics in Europe is extremely important. So can NATO exist without the US? I doubt that. Is there a serious risk? Let's face it. From a European point of view, we are one tweet away from the end of NATO. So on the one hand, we rely without any serious alternative on our American friends. On the other hand, we have to become stronger as Europeans because we live where we live. And I see the rise of Eurasia as an alternative to transatlantic space. So hopefully our American friends will not abandon NATO.
Daniel, a quick comment from you from the Bulgarian perspective.
I try to be quick, even if this is a large topic and it is worth spending some time on it. But first, when I said the Soviet Union lives in the heads of a lot of people in Eastern Europe, what I meant was mainly not that those people want the Soviet Union back necessarily, but the attitude in public life, the level of participation and readiness to participate in civil society interaction is a Soviet-minded attitude for a lot of people. A lot of people approach this as politics is not for me. Politics is for people there who do some type of dirty deals behind the scenes. We don't know. I don't want to have anything to do with this. I'm not going to vote because my vote doesn't count. I'm not going to participate in this rally or that rally. I'm not going to defend this cause or that cause because it doesn't matter. That's the problem with the Soviet Union being in the heads of some people. I very often, if there's someone grateful, extremely grateful for the enlargement of NATO and the European Union in this room, this is me. If that was not the case with Bulgaria and other countries, we would have been another, I'm not really sure, another Ukraine probably, or another Moldova, in a very, very difficult situation. And I really sympathize with Ukraine and with Moldova right now. They don't know how to get out of this pressure which comes from the East. And we need to help them. And that is one of the missions of NATO nowadays, to help those countries who are under pressure and who want to be part of this military and political alliance, as Secretary Albright reminded us, because we very often forget this, that this is also an alliance of values. And we need to help those who want to belong to the community of those values deal with the problems and the threats which come from the East right now. There's a clear challenge against the democracies right now. And we are a little bit behind in responding and replying in an adequate way. Besides the military and defense functions, which NATO is building, those capabilities which are needed in order to reassure the allies, NATO also has, in the contemporary terms, role in combating disinformation. That is one of those areas where NATO has the capability and the opportunity and the possibility to craft the necessary tools which help the allies to defend themselves against malicious disinformation and campaigns which aim at sowing distrust in the democratic institutions and building, expanding social cleavages which have been traumatic in different societies for different reasons, historically.
Let's now do, in order to maximize the number of questions, let's aggregate 4 of them and then ask each of you at the end to kind of pick one to answer. Let's have a question right here. Yep.
Yeah, thanks a lot. My name is Daria. I'm a gender studies student. And I would like to thank Mr. Mitov for your perspective, which is quite close to mine, being Russian-Ukrainian. And I was delighted to hear from the Secretary Albright about the privatization, and that probably one of the problem is that we are here not that concerned with the deep personal experience of the terrific, for example, starvation of people starving in the Soviet Union or post-Soviet Union during the 1991, for example. And my question is here, how do you see whether there is an option to systematically remember that politics is not only about by people or about people, but also for people who live in the political situations that we have?
Okay. Question, yeah, middle of the back, yeah. There you go. And then behind you will be after that. Yeah, go ahead, fire away, question.
Hello, thank you for every member of the panel discussion. I'm going to have a question to Mr. Fischer. So what do you think, what is Russian role of Russia in the unity of European Union? Recently, I had to read for one of my classes a paper about Trojan horses, which Russia is constructed in the European Union. So what do you think? What is the role of Russian soft power in the unity?
Okay, and then behind you at the back there?
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. Yeah, the title of this talk says avoiding new walls. And I would say there is a difference between old walls of socialist bloc and new walls. Old walls in the socialist blocks were meant to keep the people getting out of the states. Today's the walls that are being built are basically the walls that are keeping them away entering the states. So what we are seeing is basically these new walls are the symptoms of a world being encircled in certain identitarian normative containers. We talk about West, Russia, Islam, China, Africa. And when we produce this kind of identitarian normative blocks, we basically also produce rhetorics that has political consequences. What does it mean for some granny living in Ukraine to put a gun against her head and ask her, are you for Russia or are you for Ukraine or are you for West? How these identitarian containers that people are pushed into, how they have consequences and produce realities that have very dire effects.
Question here, and I think that'll probably be all we'll have time for, right here.
Okay. I'll keep it brief. Thank you, Mr. Mitov and Mr. Fischer. But my question's for Ms. Albright, or Madam Secretary, so it's an honor for me to refer to you as that. You served as Secretary of State with a roughly 4-year tenure in the Clinton administration. And so my question is that what advice can you give us students, or me personally, an aspiring U.S. diplomat, what advice can you give us on how to avoid new walls for the future? What do you see potential barriers that we will have to confront in the future?
And we have a question from the front row here, and that will definitely be the last one.
So I just had a question actually for Joschka regarding accession. And in 2000, you laid down a very bold proposal: accession as fast as possible, integration as fast as possible. And when I look at the work that we did at the at Open Society Foundation, it seemed that if we made one mistake, it was in this view that we never subscribed to an idea of the end of history. We subscribed to an idea that so long as all these countries could get into Europe, mission accomplished. And we literally did that. We spun off the foundations. We took money out of the region, and now we're going to have to put it. Back in. But the other thing that hasn't come up is the role of 2008 and Germany's and what happened to Europe and what happened to Germany then. And I wonder if you could speak to what you think these long-lasting damages have been from that for the region and for Europe as a whole. And I just also want to reassure you on NATO. Given Trump's unpopularity, NATO is more popular among the U.S. population than it's ever been. So I don't think U.S. is leaving anytime soon.
Okay, so we have questions about accession. We have accession questions about identitarian closure. We have a question about walls. We have another question that about Russia and Trojan horses. There we are. So let's go along the row very quickly. Summary comments, conclusions, because we're running the clock. Perhaps Joschka first, and then conclude.
Very, very shortly, Europe. I think in the aftermath of the financial crisis, nobody in the Anglo-Saxon world believed that the EU will survive and the euro will survive. It did, with all the problems, which we have. But it survived. And if you look to the last European elections, it was a great success. It rejected the nationalism. And not only in one corner of the European Union, new member states, old member states, north and south, rich and poor, all the same. So I'm pretty optimistic. What we are now, the challenge we face is at the top, Donald Trump. Europe must become a power in a certain way, whether we like it or not. We must. And if we are interested in preserving NATO, it means the transatlantic alliance. And Europe is essentially, must be essentially interested in that, because we are at the very western fringe of the Eurasian supercontinent. China is knocking at our doors, and our internal problems, demographic problems, everybody knows that. So we need a strong transatlantic backing. I think our American friends beyond Trump will not accept that we contribute not much more to our security, but it's not only security, it's also the digital revolution. I mean, Europe must become a power. And it's not easy. I don't want to go too much into the details, but it's not easy. But we have to do it. And it cannot be done without Germany. And for Germany especially, it's very complicated. But we have to move in that direction if we are interested in a future for the transatlantic alliance. So from that point of view, Europe, positive. Russia, soft power of Russia. Well, if Russia wants to increase its soft power, it's legitimate. How they do it is the question. And during the Cold War, the West was pretty sophisticated in these questions. We had Radio Free Europe and other institutions which were highly efficient and highly sophisticated. But whether Putin is too successful, I doubt. His intervention into American presidential politics, I doubt whether this was a great idea. By the way, this is my experience. I think at the moment when intelligence services moving into the political sector, it usually backfires. We had this experience with the GDR. So from that point of view, yes, it's there. They will do it. And we have to be more proactive on our side. Ukraine. I mean, it's Russian propaganda to say NATO wants to encircle Russia. What for? By the way, I don't believe you can encircle Russia. But what's the sense of that? What for? Everything the West wants from Russia can be bought on global markets and can be bought from Russia. So what for? Russia is not concerned about NATO. They know NATO very well over the decades of the Cold War. Russia is concerned about, guess what? That Maidan will be repeated on the Red Square. That's the nightmare. And therefore the EU is the real enemy, because the EU represents also the culture of democracy and of the right of minorities. The Russian position is we are a Christian nation, but compared to these degenerated West, we are true believers, and sexual minority rights, no way in Russia, and They have a concept of a Christian nation which is from the day before yesterday. So this is a kind of a cultural confrontation nowadays. And, well, I think we shouldn't avoid this confrontation. We should stick to our values. I'm not concerned about the Russians. Ukraine, what did Putin achieve in Ukraine? What? What for? I mean, this was the closest, the closest nation to Russia. Russians and Ukrainians really thought one, more or less, one family, very close family. And now he has alienated his brotherly nation and sisterly nation, I guess, forever. Ukraine is a complicated challenge, not easy to deal with, but the idea, after Crimea, we can move into eastern Ukraine and the Ukrainian system will collapse, and we can divide the West. This was a complete miscalculation, let's face it. So it's not easy, but we should stick to our values. We should stick to our principles. Europe, what Europe never can accept is the Russian idea of zone of influence. If we would accept zone of influence, it would be the end of the EU. It's impossible. So I'm in favor of peaceful solutions. I'm in favor of dealing with Russia, but not for the price to give up our Eastern European allies, and not for the price to give out the basic principles of the European identity, which is slowly emerging.
Well, I am very worried about the walls because what is happening is they are enclosing smaller and smaller pieces, and the disintegration of what I saw, what you were talking about, Joschka, really a Europe that was coming together. And it was actually the first President Bush who talked about a Europe whole and free that was going to be a partner of the United States, not a subject of the United States. And so I'm very worried about the creation of walls. And I'm trying to, I mentioned earlier the issue of identity. I think we are all entitled to our identity. It's very interesting. I just spent some time with President Clinton, and he, in different ways, has been saying the same thing for a long time. And one of it is, he said, according to genetics, 99.9% of all of us is exactly the same. And he has been delivering this message for a long time, and it's something that one can have an identity, but also to understand our common identity. The thing that I was trying to get an image of, however, is that we all, or most of us, like to have gardens, and we do put fences around the gardens. The important part, though, is to have a gate in the fence and invite people over for barbecues, so that it is not a matter of keeping things out, but just kind of having something that you think is yours, but is open to others. Now, I was just in Berlin with some young students, and they asked me what was going to be the next wall. And I think the next wall is disinformation or information, that it is creating divisions among us. It is going to be harder to detect, and yet it is what is dividing us and really putting into people's heads that the other people are bad or every other thing. And so I think that we need to be very concerned about the building of a new wall. I am appalled at what is happening in the United States. I'm an immigrant in the United States, and I do believe that every country needs to be able to have an immigration policy. That is a sovereign right, but it has to be done in some way that is fair. And so I have said that the Statue of Liberty is weeping because it is, the message under it is being changed, and building walls to keep people out is, I think, un-American. So I think I am against walls. I might be for white picket fences with gates in them.
Thank you. Daniel Mitov, final comment.
Very quickly on Russia and the Trojan horses, we do have a problem, and we do need to realize that. But I'm not. I'm worried, but I'm not dramatically concerned, because as Minister Fischer was saying, we will survive this. Systems like what has been created right now in Russia, they don't survive. They can prolong for quite a while. They could be tough to change, but they inevitably fail, and we will see that. What Russia does today has two dimensions: internal and external. What kind of world Russia wants in order for Mr. Putin and the Kremlin to be a real world factor, because economically Russia doesn't qualify as one of the biggest players in the world. Politically also, but when it comes to a different world, if Russia manages to change the international settings, then they will have a better chance to be a significant player. And what I mean is, the European Union and NATO are a problem for Russia, because they're huge blocks of countries with common values who can stand together and defend certain type of principles. If we have a 19th century world where sovereignty, national sovereignty, stands as absolute top principle in the international relations, unquestioned principle, and all the rest, human rights, freedom of speech, rule of law, and so on, are under the carpet, not mentioned at all, don't play any role in the international relations, that's the world which Russia would like to see, where they... That's what they strive for. That's why they meddle. That's why they're trying to break the transatlantic bond. That's why they're trying in every possible way to see whether they can actually dismantle the European Union or get pieces out of there. They mainly use disinformation and let's say the acceleration of those internal social conflicts which I was mentioning earlier through social media. Right now, this is quite easy to do. That's one thing. And second, corruption. I was mentioning this as well. They operate according to, and you might laugh here, but that's actually something that is very real. They operate according to an old Bolshevik principle, which basically says there's no crime which a capitalist would not commit for $3 million. That's what they think. Now, that was said in 1917. $3 million now are quite more than that. But it's a different amount. But that's what they think of us, and they create that moral equivalency between their system and the liberal democracies, saying there's no such thing as freedom. There's no such thing as freedom of speech, freedom of choice. There's no such thing as democracy in general, as will of the people. You democracies are the same like us. You're corrupt like us, but you have, through the time, developed a sophisticated system of levers with which you manipulate your societies. And we're going to expose you. That's what they're trying to do, creating those type of false equivalencies, which are for sure recognized, and there are sympathizers of that narrative in Europe as well. And through certain amount of capital, you can achieve a lot with some political parties, with some non-governmental organizations, and so on. But that's a false narrative, and it will fall short in time with.
Secretary Albright wanted to have one word.
The thing that I'd like to do is to thank you very much for hosting this, because part of, as you mentioned, the group of former foreign ministers, we can meet wherever we want to, whenever we want to. But it was very important to come to Vienna to meet with you, because I think that CEU is an example of the kinds of things that have to happen in terms of having free speech, of learning from the past, but pushing towards the future. And so thank you very, very much for hosting us, and thank you all for your very kind questions. And Alex, pass this on to your father.
Thank you. That's a better conclusion than I could possibly venture. I want to conclude with one comic moment. The last thing travelers want is to have a heavier suitcase. And I'm about to make their suitcases heavier. But it's our way as a research-intensive university of thanking each participant. We did a very searching book called Rethinking Open Society, which is really rethinking the legacy of '89. We've also done some very serious work on what academic freedom means in the 21st century. So we're loading up your suitcases, but I hope when you receive these clumsy, heavy gifts, you'll go back home remembering just how deeply grateful CEU was for your presence here today. Thank you so much.